exclusively eat either insects, mammals, reptiles, amphibians. They're not actually going to eat any types of seeds or berries. As far as their distribution goes, they're fairly widely distributed across the United States, all the way up into Canada and down into Mexico. Shrikes that breed up north generally migrate south during the wintertime, so we're starting to see a lot of migratory loggerhead shrike show up in Kentucky. Our population's generally at an all-time high right now, and it will be until spring when they go back up north to breed. As far as their abundance, though, they are much more abundant in the western United States. There is an eastern U.S. population, but it's much more sparse than out west. And you can even see in Kentucky, they're pretty sparse. Western part of the state's got a lot more. During the non-breeding season, central Kentucky tends to fill up a little bit. But for the most part, there's a lot of empty gaps. And if you notice, all of eastern Kentucky is blank, except for, I don't know if y'all can see it, but there's a nice small little wintertime population down there. And that just happens to coincide with some old strip mines that have, it's actually really good shrike habitat now. So speaking of habitat, shrikes really need four things. For nesting sites, they need trees or shrubs that are pretty spiky, or at least provide a lot of good cover for their nests. Shrikes don't like to build nests in kind of open trees. They like them to be really, really hard, and that makes them really hard to find. They require perches. This can be, things like road signs, telephone poles, snags, a pretty open tree, like I was just talking about, not good for nests, but it's good for them to sit up on and look for prey. These are good because shrikes are generally hawking predators, so they'll sit there, they'll scan the landscape, and they'll see something kind of crawling around in the grass, and they'll go grab it and bring it back to their perch generally. They need these foraging areas where they can see those animals. So if you have really, really tall grass, it typically doesn't really work well for shrikes in Kentucky. In some of the other habitats across the range it does, but our birds are usually in pretty patchy habitat, short, open ground to medium, short grass. And they need an impaling site of some sort. This can be something like a locust tree, sage orange, it can be barbed wire. As long as they're allowed to press their prey into those thorns, it'll work for them. And this is what shrike are most famous for, right? Is impaling their prey items. So we're talking about how they have a lot of raptor-like tendencies. So they like to eat large prey items. They'll take prey as large as they are. So a shrike's about 48 grams on the heavy side. And they'll take things just as big. So I found impalements of like eastern bluebirds, which is about the same size as a shrike. But they do these impalements for a couple different reasons. The first is if you are a shrike and you don't actually have talons, right? You can't grip your prey. So you can't hold it down, you can't eat it that way. So they use these thorns, these pieces of barbed wire, essentially as talons. They'll impale their prey on it, and that gives them a little bit more purchase so that they can start eating it. I need to get to this. So as far as what they're eating, during the summertime, during the breeding season, they're eating mostly insects. They will hunt other things, but when there's so many insects in the landscape, typically go after them because they're so much easier to catch. It's less risky. You don't have to worry about a mouse rolling over and taking a bite out of you. But during the wintertime, when there's a lot less insects on the landscape, they're going to start pivoting towards those vertebrate prey. They're going to be pursuing small mammals. They'll go after, like larger crayfishes, in streams. So their prey size typically goes up during the wintertime.
Is that a caterpillar on the right?
Some type of larva. I can't tell if it's a sawfly.
Oh.
It was a little decomposed when I got up there.
Oh.
So the way that shrike generally hunt is that they will, like I said, they'll go and they'll sit up on a perch somewhere. They'll see their prey and they'll down and grab it. What they like to do is approach it from behind, and they'll typically, if it's a vertebrate, so if it's a mouse, they'll go and they'll actually attack the back of the neck. They'll use that hooked beak, and they actually have some, they're called toenail teeth. So there's the hook, and there's these little jagged spikes, almost like little vampire teeth. And they'll use those to go into the back of the neck, and they'll sever the vertebrae right below the skull, and they'll actually snap the spinal cord. And that renders their prey pretty much dead or at least paralyzed. And then they can take it and they'll fly that prey item back to their perch or back to their impalement site. where they can eat it, or they'll also just leave it there. They create food caches called larders, where they can have food for the times that are scarce, and it's also used as an attractant for their potential mates, right? If I have a bunch of food, it shows what a good hunter I am. My genes are really good. You should probably mate with me, right? So really, if you think about these impalements, they're an evolutionary adaptation, right? You can have bigger and bigger food items. It's better for food reliance, and you don't have to worry about evolving talents over time. And then just kind of a cool fun fact about these impalements too. Sometimes they'll prey upon noxious animals like monarch butterflies, right? They're toxic, you can't just eat them. So they'll impale them, they'll let those toxins break down to the point where they can digest them. And they do this outside their range, like on blubber grasshoppers. There's an eastern narrow-mouthed toad that's pretty toxic, and they'll impale them, wait for the skin to kind of degrade a little bit so they can actually stomach it. And another thing that's really cool that Shrike do that raptors do is they actually form pellets. So if you think about owls, they regurgitate those pellets, all the things that they can't digest. Shrike do that as well. So all of the little bits of chitin from insects, if they were to somehow ingest some bones or fur or anything like that, they will regurgitate those. These things are pretty small, they're about ½ an inch long. And can anyone else think of a songbird that actually regurgitates pellets?
That's cool.
Yeah. As far as breeding goes, they're seasonally monogamous, so they'll pair up with an individual, and they'll typically stay with them the whole season. Shrikes can be double brooded, so they can have multiple nests in a single breeding season. And sometimes there's seasonal divorces where, if the male's not helping out enough, the female will go find another male, and then she'll try again with them after her young fledged from that first nest. On average, Shrikes lay between 5 or 6 eggs. I think they can go all the way up to 8 though. Typically, eggs hatch within 15 to 17 days, and then young will actually leave the nest between 17 and 20 days. And right after the young fledge from the nest, they do this, it's kind of adorable. They're learning how to impale things. So they'll take inanimate objects like leaves, and they'll start sticking them on thorns, just trying to figure out what mom and dad are doing, how to do that, how can I do that too. And then after about 40 days, they'll disperse from their natal sites and they'll go find their own territories, or go hang out with their siblings for the winter time until the next breeding season when they'll try to feed on their own. And I just think a nest full of young shrikes is just about the cutest thing in the world. So the reason we're here today is because this species is declining perilously quick. So we're looking at breeding bird survey data here, starting in 1966 up to the present. And we're seeing range-wide, and this is including the western US where they're a lot more abundant, we're seeing about their population decline about 2.8% every single year. In Kentucky specifically, it's even worse. So we're seeing about a decline of 6% per year since 1966. And Shrike in Kentucky are very unabundant. So it's really hard to parse this data out to say that they are declining at that rate. This is our kind of our best guess because they're not often picked up on these breeding bird survey routes. So then we can look at things like eBird, which this isn't going to make you feel any better. We're seeing declines across their range. Between 2012 to 2022, their population declined by 26.1%. And then just in Kentucky, almost 30% during that time frame. So since 1966, we know their populations declined by 76%, which is absolutely staggering. And what's kind of perplexing is that this isn't a habitat issue. There's plenty of habitat available for them. We often see there's huge tracts of lands that should house shrikes that do not. And it's got to the point where 2/3 of all of the state wildlife action plans in Kentucky or in the US have loggerhead shrikes listed as a priority species. If you're not familiar with the state wildlife action plans, it's essentially what each state provides to the US Fish and Wildlife Service, saying these are our priority species for conservation. This is how we'd like to conserve them. This is the research we need to do on them. It's kind of, so in Kentucky, our state wildlife action plan is essentially the state's endangered species list. That's how it is for a lot of states. So this is a huge priority species for us in Kentucky, and it is for the majority of the states in their range. So with those declines, there's a number of different causes of decline, of these declines. Part of it's loss of habitat. You know, these areas where there used to be a lot of abundant shrikes, there's been developments coming in and removing those habitats. There's issues with biocides as well. The introduction of organochlorines kind of really coincides with that decline of the shrikes. So that's definitely a possibility that's driving this decline. Collisions with vehicles. Shrikes are often using roadways or the sides of roadways. They like to perch on power lines to hunt. They like to hunt those right-of-ways. So, you know, it's really not a shocker that shrikes get hit by cars. Adverse weather conditions are definitely a huge thing. We're seeing a lot more, you know, unpredictable, large-scale weather events like extreme cold spells, and that's causing a lot of mortality events across their range as well. I think it was 2022, we had that really bad winter storm, and every shrike in the state was gone, or at least within my survey areas. You know, they were there, and then either they migrated or they just didn't make it through those really bad winter storms. Competition with other species. European starlings are a big competitor for loggerhead shrikes. They like to inhabit the same habitats. They compete for a lot of the same food sources. And we all know that European starlings are more abundant than they ever have been. So that's a huge competition risk with them. Competition between migrating and non-migrating shrikes in the winter ground could be an issue. We really don't know if, you know, they're becoming territorial and they're out competing each other. I don't see this as much of a risk, but it's been listed in a lot of states' wildlife action plans as a problem. Reforestation efforts. You know, we usually think reforestation is a great thing, but we still need early successional habitat. We can't just have forests all over the U.S., Canada, and Central America, right? We need to have that open ground for a lot of different species. So that's part of the issue. And part of it's just natural succession, right? We're not going out and clear cutting anymore. We're not having these fallow landscapes. We're letting them succeed. So there's a huge push for grassland habitats, for early successional habitats, because this is affecting pretty much every grassland species. They're all declining pretty rapidly. Industrial and housing developments, that's just developing, taking up habitats. And then changes in agricultural practices is probably a really big thing. We no longer have these shelter belts. We don't have this messy ag anymore. Everything's pretty clean. There's not that kind of habitat that you know, houses small rodents, that houses lots of insects. So that's a huge thing. If you go out to some of these Amish farms, you're going to find things like barn owls, you're going to find loggerhead shrikes, because there's a lot more prey out there for the most part. If you have just row crop and there's nothing around it, it just goes right to the road, you're not going to have any type of habitat for these species. So what we're doing at Kentucky Fish and Wildlife, we have kind of 3 different things that we're working on. And this is all in conjunction with the Loggerhead Shrike Working Group. This is a group of scientists, researchers, conservation-minded folks that are specifically working to conserve loggerhead shrikes. So we're working on an international effort to monitor their population. We do feather sampling in order to try to figure out the population connectivity. And then we participated in some species conservation planning workshops, and we've actually put together a plan. So the first thing is that population monitoring. I am one of the non-game bird biologists, and I have a counterpart, or I have one other biologist on my team. So it's just 2 of us, and we service the whole state. We have about 18 different projects ongoing with a number of different species. So as wonderful as it would be to be able to go monitor loggerhead shrikes across the entire state, we really don't have the capacity to do that. So what we've had to do is really pare down our sampling site to a few core counties in central Kentucky, with the idea that these central Kentucky shrike populations are much more vulnerable than the western Kentucky shrike populations. It's less prime habitat, there's a lot more development going on. So we kind of treat this as our litmus for the entire state. So we go out into these counties, we pretty much survey all of the available habitat, and if we can, we try to capture shrikes. So So what we do is we actually use, this is my Shrike trap. It could also be used for lobsters potentially. So we set it up. It's essentially just a trap door. And inside, if you can tell, there's a little mouse. So we use the mouse as a lure. Unfortunately for the Shrike doesn't get any mouse dinner when we're out there. So the mouse sits in this little cage, and it causes the Shrike to come and investigate. And eventually, if we're really lucky, it'll work its way into this trap and trigger it, and it'll shut the door, and we can go up there and grab it. So once we have the Shrike in hand, we start with a US Geological Survey leg band. This is the same leg band that I put on every bird that I capture. If that bird's ever recaptured, or if it's found by someone in the landscape, they can report that band to the USGS, and they'll notify me where that bird was found, and we'll be able to figure out how old that bird was, roughly when it died or was recaptured, how far it went. So we just get a whole lot of data off those. And most of the bands I use are aluminum. Shrike are special. They get a steel band because they are powerful, and they will tear that aluminum band right off your leg. And after that, we put on these color bands. So each Shrike gets a unique color combination, and this way we can identify them from afar. We don't have to recapture them to figure out who the individual is.
So you don't have to find the number.
Exactly. So I can go out with a spotting scope, I can identify the individual, and then I share these band combos with everybody in the eastern US and Canada, so that they know if they see this unique band combination, if it's a migratory bird, or if this guy's going back to Canada or something like that, they'll know that it was, in fact, in Kentucky at some point in time. And we're going to learn a lot about the migratory connectivity that way. Because we think a lot of those birds that are coming down from the wintertime are coming from like Ontario, and just spending here briefly, and then heading back up during their breeding season. So that's a huge thing. We spend a lot of time trying to recite Shrikes. So if you're ever out and you see a Shrike, take a look at those legs if you would. And if you see any bands on there, try to remember the order of the bands on what leg, and give me a call. You will make my year, I will tell you. So after we band them, we need to determine their age and sex. So in order to age them, we typically look at their wings, see if they have any juvenile feathers still on their wings, and then using that we can determine if they're hatch year after hatch year, second years after second year birds, and then we can determine sex as well. Shrike are typically really, really hard to sex. Males are a little bit bigger, they're about 25% larger than females, but that's only great if you have two birds right next to each other. That's not usually how this works in this trap, unfortunately. So what we end up doing is we end up looking at one of these primary flight feathers, and we're trying to determine how much white is in that shaft of the feather. If it's over 2/3, it's a male. If it's less than that, it's a female. So that's one of those things that you can really only ever do in the hand. But it gives us a lot of data, and it helps us with their survival, looking at the sex ratios as well, if there's floaters in the populations, or if everyone's pretty paired up. So Shrike are one of those species that we aren't really sure what's causing the declines, and we're still very much in that research phase.
Can the males tell the females apart?
If you have them in the hand like that, you can see if they have a brood patch. So if they're using that to incubate their eggs and they're young. Males, they have what's called cloacal protuberance. It's when the cloaca extends out.
So they can tell.
They can tell. Yeah, they figured it out. We're still learning. And then after we sex and age them, we take a lot of different morphological measurements. This goes back into a database and it helps determine subspecies. Right now there's 7 identified subspecies of Loggerhead shrikes, and we're seeing that these morphological differences are also potentially, contributing to more subspecies. Someone smarter than I, or smarter than me, is compiling all this and using this for scientific research, and we're just trying to augment their studies. So after that, what we typically do is we take some feather samples. We take 2 feathers, one from the inside of the tail and one from the outside of the tail. And these go to Colorado where they're doing a genoscape analysis on them. They're trying to look at the different genetic markers on these feathers and then look at the stable isotopes and trace elements to determine where these birds are coming from, what populations they belong to. And we actually have some preliminary results here showing the relatedness of these different populations. So it's no surprise, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri are fairly related as far as their populations go. But you can see some of these Ontario birds are creeping up into us, where there's probably some overlap, where at least, maybe this feather sample in Ontario was taken, in the wintering grounds, or the summer, in the breeding season. There's some genes being spread across these populations. So there might be some floaters that are breeding in Kentucky that eventually make their way up to Canada and come back. We're still figuring it out. We still need to collect a lot more feather samples, but we're learning a lot about how they're related. I think there was a Virginia bird that was definitely had a lot of Canadian genes in it, which raised a lot of feathers with inside the Loggerhead Shrike working group, just because of what happened there. From there, we also have been participating in some species conservation planning. So for 3 years, we met very regularly within the Loggerhead Shrike working group, really to figure out what the threats that were affecting these species, the species was, or were, are, and essentially to create a management plan to how to correct this downward trajectory and turn it around so we can start recovering their population. So through this conservation planning workshop over a number of years, the first thing we decided or tried to put out was that there needs to be protections in place to conserve existing Loggerhead Shrike habitat, to identify the habitats that they're using. And all of this, I should say, this whole entire guide is available online. It's on the Loggerhead Shrike Working Group's website, if you're interested in reading it. And it goes into detail about how all of these are going to be enacted, essentially. After protections, we need to restore and enhance degraded habitats. So spots where there has been succession taking place, we need to restore that back to early successional bare ground in order to keep these birds on those habitats. We need to reduce the knowledge gaps, and that's something that we're actively doing in Kentucky. We're monitoring the feather samples, just trying to figure out what is in fact happening to our population, who's staying here, who's leaving, what's our survival like, what's our productivity like. And how to mitigate direct threats. This is something that is a lot easier to talk about than actually implement. We're talking about like those biocides, trying to figure out which ones are the issue. Trying to figure out how do we reduce vehicle strikes, how do we reduce competition. But this is something that, until we can figure it out, we can't really conserve this species, unfortunately. And that's honestly something that I would really like to get into, is trying to figure out how to implement the collection of shrikes, or take blood samples to figure out, are there actually pesticides from their prey items going into these birds? Is that possibly a cause of this decline? So that's one thing I'm looking forward to when we have a little bit more capacity, is to start taking some blood samples, send those off to labs, and trying to identify potential contaminants in these birds. And the last one is just to improve the wild populations through integrated in situ and ex situ strategies. If you're not familiar with this, essentially it's captive raising loggerhead shrikes and releasing them. There's already the Toronto Zoo is currently breeding shrikes and releasing them onto the landscapes, letting them go to help augment the wild population. I believe in Pennsylvania, the National Aviary is going to start doing this as well, just to help increase that population, because they are declining so quick that this is kind of a last-ditch effort to just throw more birds in the landscape just so they don't blink out on us. So, in a sense, shrikes are really not doing well. We have an idea what's going on. We don't have a complete answer to the whole mystery, unfortunately. Right now, like I said, we're still very much in that research phase. And a lot of it is just going to be, increasing insect abundance on the landscape, because that's what's driving a lot of declines for most birds, Shrike included, most likely. So that's kind of where we are in Kentucky. If you're interested in kind of supporting the work that we're doing, I feel like I'm being kind of a doomer here. We have a few different programs. We have Kentucky Wild, which, if you're not familiar with Kentucky Wild, it's a membership program through Kentucky Fish and Wildlife. It's every dollar that goes into Kentucky Wild goes directly back to conservation. So I used funds from Kentucky Wild to purchase mice for the shrike trapping. I use it to buy leg bands for those color bands. We build peregrine falcon boxes from the landscape, barn owl boxes, kestrel boxes. It's helped reintroduce and breed eastern hellbenders and release them back into eastern Kentucky streams. And I think one of the neatest things about Kentucky Wild too is that we actually take members out with biologists, and they help us do our field work. So I take folks to help us monitor American kestrels, they band peregrine falcons with me, they do hellbender surveys, help us build boxes for a bunch of different species, sampling attack mussels. And like I said, like this is one of those memberships where, very often, not very often, there's no overhead when it comes to the conservation efforts. And this is one of those that your $25 membership, $25 goes right back to the wildlife. With that, do you have any questions?
When you're handling the birds, is there significance in that glove that was a black, white, and gray?
That was to keep her hands warm. So
Okay, the colors was.
no, typically I go in barehanded. Yep, and I don't like gloves because I think they can slip off a little easier.
Okay.
So I usually don't worry about them.
We see a lot of shrikes in Florida. Now, do those migrate, or is that a no?
Those are typically year-round residents.
Okay.
You might get some influx of migrants, but I would be surprised if they're going that far south. In Florida and like Texas, their population, they're doing pretty well. So there's a lot more in the landscape down there. So I think in Texas, they're sometimes considered like gas station birds, which is crazy when you think about them up here. Yeah.
What size territory or whatever does a strike have? Do you have any?
So they're pretty large territories. I don't remember the number just off the top of my head. It's one of those things though, at least in Kentucky, there's not a lot of territorial disputes because there's not that many birds. Often we'll have vacant habitat all around a shrike's territory. Where they're more abundant, like in the west or down south a little bit farther, they can be kind of tight, but they're still fairly large for songbirds. I think eastern bluebird, it's like 100 meters all around it. I think shrike are about maybe 5 times that, but that's kind of a rough estimate. I'd have to look up the exact number. But they're a lot larger than a typical songbird's
I
territory.
was wondering, could I have one on my 1 acre lot putting feed on?
He's probably moving off your acre.
Yeah.
And then finding food around there. Are they nesting there, or are they just?
No, I've seen what I thought was that, and I was curious if that's what it was, if it was.
Yeah, maybe. Sometimes people will get them confused with mockingbirds too, especially if you're just kind of seeing them at a glance, because they have that same kind of white, gray, and black plumage. But this part of the state, very well, it's probably shrike.
I was going to ask you, are you able to locate their nests, or do you ever look for nests?
Yeah, I have.
How successful are you in locating them?
Not as successful as I'd like to be. They're hard to find. Typically what I'll do is I'll find a pair.
Well, I just remember years ago when there used to be, not that uncommon here in Daviess County, I found 2 of them, and they were both in hackberry trees.
Yeah, which sounds about right. Hackberries can be kind of scrubby, right?
But y'all are not very successful.
So most of our shrike work just based, like I said, we have so many projects going on. We spend a lot of time working on shrikes in the winter. So that's when most of our efforts are. Occasionally, if we're out and we find a shrike, we'll try to capture them and we'll try to find their nest. But
I was just wondering if you ever monitored the fledglings, if you located nest.
we've kept eyes on them. Actually, we found a lot that are post-fledging. So we know where the nest is, where we think it is at least, or we find any nest that's probably belongs to them. And then we'll have 5 fledglings on the landscape, plus 2 parents. And then we'll keep eyes on them, try to capture as many as we can and put bands on them so we can identify them. Hopefully re-find them later on different territories, which, to be honest with you, we've been very unsuccessful with just because they're just disappearing. And that's part of the issue that we're having, is that we can find shrike, we can ban them, and then they're gone. Next breeding season, they're not in the same territories. They're not anywhere near where they were before.
How successful are you in dealing with the changes in agriculture?
Unfortunately, not very successful at all. That's, Kentucky Fish and Wildlife.
Because that affects lots of birds, not just the
it
shrike.
absolutely does. Yeah, we're not a regulatory agency in that way. In fact, so I can provide a recommendation to individual farmers. We have private lands biologists that go out and have recommendations to help them implement habitat. So to some degree, it's successful. That's only if that landowner wants to have that happen.
Mm-hmm.
We're not in any way we can't start enforcing laws.
I guess I'm wondering if there would be some some campaigns that were done, you know, to encourage landowners to go back to the old ways.
Yeah, I think we certainly could try, and I would love to help champion that. I don't have the capacity currently, but
It's not my field, that's.
no, I'm right there with you. But like it's gonna be one of those things where there's a reason why I changed it over, because it became a lot less expensive. Your
Right,
yields
I mean,
a lot
they-
higher. But you're absolutely correct. If we went back to, you know, having those, you know, shelter belts, we went back to, you know, not having row crop as maximized as possible, we would be in a lot better shape for a number of grassland early succession species. You know,
Maybe we just need more Amish farmers.
would be a solution.
I echo Judy's sentiment. I mean, if we are in Amish territory, I guess we ought to be looking for them, huh?
Yeah, and if you find them, there's a number of things you can do. One would be if you use eBird, report it on eBird, because that's going to help us with these population trends. And I pull data directly from eBird all the time to figure out where these birds are. Even Shrike outside of our study area, I'm still taking notes of where they are to keep track of them. I'm just not putting hands on them, essentially. Other questions?
Right, when I was a little girl and I was walking on the farm along the fence road, locust tree, thorns sticking out, and I saw a frog that had I thought it impaled himself. I thought, oh, he just had an unlucky jump and about 40 feet over there. So was that probably a loggerhead?
Probably, yeah. I've never heard of a frog impaling itself. But I've seen them impale frogs, so.
I just never realized that.
Yeah. And there's actually if you all are familiar with iNaturalist, it's like eBird, but it's for all the species. There's actually a project on there, I think it's called the Shrike Locker. And folks are just taking, the larger locker, and people take photos of impalements with GPS coordinates so that researchers can find out where these shrikes are as well. So that's another avenue if you wanted to report these via community science.
We've had a shrike on our Christmas count the last 3 years. I'm not sure if it's more than that or not, I don't remember. But we see him in the winter, but don't see him in the summer. Is he going to Canada?
Possibly, or it could be a local bird that is wintering in one area where there's more abundant food, and then go and breed somewhere else where there's better resources during that time of the year. It's one of those things where we don't really know what their local movements are like either. I would love to use the MODIS network and put tags on these birds and kind of look at more localized movements as well as long distance movements. But Shrike, being what they are, will tear that tag off their back.
I was going to say, is there any kind of tag you can?
Not yet. I've been told they're actively working on Shrike-proof tags. Up in Canada, they've deployed some, but they get torn off pretty much immediately, or their antennas get snipped off, which renders them useless. But that's one of those things that, we have this network going on all over the world, and it really should be leveraged for this species. But the Shrike-proofness is not there yet. Any other questions? Yeah.
You had said Kentucky Wild is one of the best ways to donate. Are there any other organizations that go more directly towards shrikes or just kind of adjacent to?
I'm not sure. That's a great question. There's a number. I'm trying to remember. There's it's like R2S2. I can't remember what it stands for, but essentially they designate different, essentially imperiled species, and they provide funding for research for conservation efforts. And Shrike is one that they're very interested in as well. Actually, helped to fund this whole project. So that I think it's R2S2 is what it's called.
R2S2.
And it stands for something like recovery, but I'm totally blanking on the actual acronym. Yes.
Do you know who in Colorado is doing the genetics?
It's the Rue Lab. Amber Rue, I think is her name, University of Colorado. Yeah, and she does not just shrikes, but she has a whole number of species that she's doing similar work for. So like we're contributing data for like magnolia warblers right now, American red stars, just to help better look, understand their populations and their movements as well. Any other questions?
As a lot of species are in decline, are there other, of course, similar target wildlife species or game or non-game where you can, okay, we're managing for shrikes, but we're helping some others as well? Are there others that really kind of match the shrike habitat or just overlap? Or?
So shrike are unique, where like they don't fit in well with a lot of those other species. That's why
They don't play well with
Yeah.
others.
Yes, and as far as their habitat usage too, where they really like that dirty ag. Like barn owls like that too. But like we talk about like, quail, and, henslow sparrows, grasshopper sparrows, they're using different types of early successional habitat. So if I were to go out and manage a place just for henslow sparrows, shrike would use it. Yeah. So you really need that kind of open patch with a single kind of perch in the middle of all of it, with a nest tree or shrub of some sort. And that's just not good for a lot of things, unfortunately. Barn owls will like it because they can see their prey, but that's pretty much it as far as I'm aware.
It'd be nice if it was tied to some other game species
Oh, yeah.
habitat where there'd be
Yeah.
a lot of management and funding to really kind of pour into it.
Yeah, I was actually at a meeting with a bunch of quail folks not too long ago. We were talking about something just like that, and when they were describing the perfect quail habitat, that's not good for a whole lot of things besides quail, which is unfortunate,
And quail's concerned in the southeast too.
Yeah. Other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you all for having me. If folks are interested, I have some Kentucky Wild information up here as well as stickers and then magnets. Next year we're doing our big barn owl survey across Kentucky. So if you're aware of any barn owl nests or roosts, or you know of folks that have them, my contact information is on one of those magnets. If you wanted to take one for yourself and give one to someone else, that'd be much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you all.